very much indeed, Tony. I think you've guaranteed some very good debate. I've certainly found as the lecture progressed, you were finding an awful lot of contradictions and paradoxes in the way I think about the provision of services. When you think about the audience we've got here, a very large proportion work in the voluntary sector, which is, of course, famous for celebrating diversity, while at the same time arguing absolutely for fairness. Yep. We have many people here from local government as well, all, I'm sure, looking forward to the reality of increased localism and the opportunities for determining their own services. But equally, I suspect, all ready to argue very fiercely for standards of service.
John from the County Councils Network. Thank you, Tony. That was very interesting. I'm going to ask, as you would probably expect from me, about how you feel about geographic scale for local self-determination on particular issues. Tying it to your example of the smoking ban, which I thought was an interesting one, I can see how your example would make sense if, for instance, Liverpool and Manchester had banned smoking, but Leeds and Glasgow had not. I'm less clear how it might have worked out if Camden and Lambeth had banned smoking and Southwark and Islington had not. It would have been, I think, much harder to judge the outcomes and much weirder for people to see that they could smoke in the pub on one side of the street, but they couldn't smoke in the pub on the other side of the street. How do you think that's resolved?
Rob Smith, Deputy Chair of Place to Be, children's charity. I was very taken with your analysis, and I thought it was very compelling. I can see in education where the pressure for more choice can lead to people not being kind of stuck with their local schools if they don't like them in poor areas. I can see how that can work. I find it more difficult in social services to see in child and adult social services where the pressure is for improvement and for the temptation to prioritise away from social service spending to be resisted.
I'm not so sure that it would be that odd if Camden and Lambeth went one way and Southwark and Islington went the other. I mean, I know that this is not an entirely serious example, but I can remember wanting to view a film which some years ago, I think it was Westminster's licensing authority had banned, but Camden's had allowed, so you could walk from the Curzon Soho up Shaftesbury Avenue, sorry, non-Londoners, to what was the thing called the Odeon in Shaftesbury Avenue, and you could see the film, just from walking up the road. Now, it's a trivial example, but actually you do get differences in things like public health policies and refuse collection and disposal and recycling from borough to borough. I live on a borough boundary and there are quite wide differences. And I'm not sure that actually a smoking ban wouldn't have been rather well tested in a big city like London, because people could indeed, we'd have seen if there was the impact on the bars in places on one side of the road compared with the other. And I think that the experimentation would probably have worked rather better. So I would be prepared to go with kind of, I'm generally not really in favour of local government reorganisations myself. So I just go with the level of councils we've got, primary districts most of the time. So I think we can live with this kind of difference myself. And they certainly, in other countries around the world where municipalities are much smaller than here, you do get quite big differences in neighbouring areas. And, another trivial example, when I was a child brought up in North Wales, I was in a town that was dry, you couldn't drink on a Sunday, and over in Denbighshire you could, so pubs were shut in one side of a boundary and open on the other. So I think we can sort of live with that. Now, the second question about social services, I can see that social services has a less, and I wasn't really arguing for, I did argue for a kind of competition, and it was very much the civic competition that was described in this quote from the 19th century. It was that kind of competition, rather than the sort of flat-out quasi-market competition, which we could discuss another time, which has been much in vogue recently. I want the sort of competition between towns and cities, which I think does drive higher public service standards more in many ways than the quasi-market competition, though I'm not saying that's a bad idea either. And I think that in terms of the way, especially with the national media, public services that don't work in one area compared with another, I think will be picked up by the national media. So if social services didn't work very well in some places, I think the national media would highlight that. Or if there was a lack of a willingness to spend. But I mean, there's a generic problem with personal social services, particularly for adults and for older people, for mental health, which is that the lobby groups are by no means as powerful as they are for other services. But you might think that, for example, counties that have large populations of older people would indeed devote more money, and indeed I think do, to personal social services for older people than other authorities where there are smaller such populations. So I think, again, it would lead to differentiation in the likelihood of expenditure, which would, to some extent, reflect different local needs. I mean, the issue of how social services creates an argument for itself more generally is, being made around us now, when nobody's protecting social services spending, where the NHS and to schools, to some extent, are by national government.
I think the interpretation that we've had of postcode lotteries is of the idea that the services are delivered differently based on local needs and assessments. And I'm not sure anyone could really argue against having local needs assessment and meeting those. I suppose one of the problems is when geography is used as a proxy for those needs, and that breaks down if the boundaries are themselves artificial. I think the example of smoking is quite a nice one, really. If you have smoking on one side of the road and non-smoking on the other side of the road, you can have that as a sort of experiment. Where people aren't so happy with it is if you develop lung cancer on one side of the road and get it treated, and someone else across the road also has it and doesn't get it treated. And I'd welcome your thoughts on that.
My name is Doug Snowd.
Yep.
Yes. Sorry, and I'm with the CTBI, which is a charity for travelling people. I wonder, I feel that the point that you have made about postcode lotteries and the influence that they can have on our receipt of services and so on is probably quite right. But I'm afraid that, in my opinion, people's aspirations have been altered over the years, and unfortunately now they all believe that they can get services for nothing. I mean, we're told that the National Health Service is free, and yet if I want to go and get a pair of glasses, I have to pay. If I want my teeth attended to, I have to pay. Because it soon was found, after people went and collected vast amounts of things from the chemists which were free, prior to that they hadn't been, that this country couldn't sustain it. And I think this is with education. 50% of the children are expected to go to university. Why? The people who go to who should go to university are those who would really benefit from it.
Today we have vast transfers of funds all around the country from those parts of the country which are wealthy to those that are poorer. And is there not a problem in an environment where you have those massive transfers having significant differences? I mean, you gave the example perhaps of Scotland and tuition fees, that actually because there are vast transfers of money going to Scotland, there is perhaps a sense, well, if you can have your tuition fees at that level, well, then you don't need as much money from the centre. So is there a conflict between big transfers of funds around the country and the postcode lottery?
Yes, the question of you know, okay to have a different smoking ban on one side of the country, one side of the road to the other, not so good if cancer treatment. I mean, I can see precisely the argument that that people would think that, but I think what I was trying to argue earlier on is that it appears to be virtually impossible using national institutions, national money, targets, everything, to avoid some differentiation from place to place. That is, and I'm not sure we'd really know what the same treatment was, because in the end you'd end up trying to remove how a doctor's discretion, presumably. Doctors must have discretion to whether they send you to a consultant or don't send you to a consultant, and so on. So I think I'm sort of moving slightly further to arguing that it's a kind of reasonable to expect, you know, that service free at the point of delivery, and that there should, as far as possible, be the presumption that services will improve everywhere. But I'm not sure it's possible, even in principle, even if even if the people are not on either side of a PCT currently boundary, there'll be more of them soon, either side of a boundary. The chances are that simply going into the hospital or to a GP and then to a hospital on different days would get you different treatment, wouldn't it? And in a sense, things will always be different. So I can see absolutely that most of us would think it was right that wherever you went for treatment for any illness in England, now different in Wales and Scotland, you'd be treated the same. But I'm not sure that in practice that's ever quite as achievable as the aspiration would be. And as I say, that's reinforced by the fact that if you try to equalise some things, you'll unequalise others, which kind of goes to Michael's point about I'll come back to that, about the redistribution of money and whether we have to, about that issue. So I'll come back to that. It may not be a very good answer, but I just think that we're we're sort of chasing something that's impossible, even if we really, really think it's the right thing to do. I mean, the issue of what we will pay for, which I touched on, which isn't, and it's my fault, I mean, it's not directly part of the argument about the welfare state, but I do think the contradictions in what we all want of government, which politicians have to some extent encouraged, I might add. Competitive politics has encouraged politicians to offer more than realistically, in my view, the state can deliver. And that again sets the state up to fail, which is unfair on the public servants trying to deliver the services, which is why I made the complicated argument, or the argument at the beginning about, trying to achieve very, very advanced levels of equal outcomes in a society where we allow people to have very, very, very different incomes, personal incomes. And I just think that's putting too much pressure on public services myself. And I do take the point that probably politicians have competitively wanted to offer more and more and more from the state without ever being willing, putting it bluntly, quite to argue the case for the higher taxes that go, or that would have to go with, a much bigger state. That is a sense of, it's not directly related to today's discussion, but it is there. If you look at the average level of tax as a proportion of GDP paid in this country in the last 20 or 30 years, it's been around 38%, and the average scale of public spending as a proportion of GDP is about 42% in recent years. And that difference can't be sustained forever. And that is a problem. And I think that's more about politicians adjusting our expectations, either to lower public expenditure or to higher levels of taxation. You could do either, but you can't have the two separate. Then the question about the Victorian cities. It's true, Victorian cities were raising most of their money from the rates, and there wasn't much equalisation. Sidney Webb hadn't written his great tome, and this is what led George Lansbury to end up in prison, and Poplarism and all of that. That was a protest about this. But you could sustain redistribution of resources around the country without necessarily having control over how the money, or trying to equalise the way the money was delivering services throughout the country. These things can be separated, indeed are to some extent. So you could reallocate money, and we do have it. I mean, the quote I gave from the Telegraph actually said, for instance, Islington in North London spent £259 per capita on mental health, compared with £66 in Bracknell Forest. That's seen as a bad thing by the King's Fund and in this article. Actually, it's because of the redistribution of money of the kind you're arguing for. So redistributing money from rich areas to poor areas produces an uneven distribution, which you can see as a postcode lottery as well. So we are, as I say, chasing things all over the place here. So, but I do think you could, and indeed in many ways, Britain has delivered higher levels of public, it has literally delivered higher levels of public spending and public service in poor areas than in more affluent areas by redistribution to local government, redistribution within the health service. Whether it's enough, different issue. But it's not true of all countries, and even some European countries don't do it as much as Britain does. So I think you can retain inter-authority, inter-area redistribution of resources, but not necessarily then also try and deliver exactly the same service outputs and outcomes everywhere.
I think don't want to say representative, but a hardcore volunteer sector supporter and slog in the trenches, I would be less apprehensive about the postcode lottery if I was more secure about commissioning. Intelligent commissioning, informed commissioning, and visionary commissioning. Because as far as the postcode lottery goes, let's face it, it's the voluntary sector that very often picks up the pieces of the impact of the postcode lottery. Not in all services, but certainly in some social care services, what I would call the softer services, okay, that can enhance and change people's lives. So I think as voluntary sector, we're very concerned about that. You can find some very enlightened and good commissioning in some local authorities, and you can't even find a commissioner to talk to in other local authorities as a volunteer sector. And I think when there can be some addressing some of that, I think we would all feel a little bit more secure about the outcomes of a postcode lottery, appreciating that innovation drives performance improvement. Believe me, we know that. We're asked to deliver on that all the time. So that's not anathema to us. And also our concern about these targets that can distort outcomes, outputs, and disincentivize. So again, it's the intelligent commissioning that needs to come in addressing this, particularly as in respect to the volunteer sector.
Jim Winter from St Saviour's Charity. Can I just follow on the question about redistribution of resources? Yep. Is it implied in what you're saying that you would also support greater differences in terms of ability to raise funds at the local level? So, for example, greater freedom to raise council tax, greater freedom, like in the United States, maybe to raise sales tax, maybe going back again with the redistribution cap, maybe, but on the national non-domestic rates. So, would you see more power also to raise funds or not?
I can see that the standard of existing providers, not just local government, I'm sure, will vary very substantially. As I said all along, and I'm not having a go at the NHS, absolutely not. It is intriguing, though, how all the stories which come right across the spectrum about differences in public provision are most obvious in the National Health Service, which is absolutely supposed to be a National Health Service, and 60 years worth of effort. Now, I infer from that commissioning and/or decision-making in different parts of the NHS varies very, very considerably. And I would infer from that the differences between local authorities are, in a sense, not necessarily linked to their being their local government rather than the health service being the health service. Indeed, sad to say, almost all the research I've ever undertaken about quality of public services tends to come back to the same conclusion, which is if the leadership's good, it's good, and if they're not, it isn't. I mean, that's a bit tragically simple, but overwhelmingly, and that kind of goes to your commissioning point. Clearly, well-run local authorities, the best-run ones, and that have thought most about how to commission services, will self-evidently be better than those in the opposite position. And I can see how frustrating that will be for voluntary organisations working in lots of places at once. What I'm not at all sure about is whether trying to eradicate, and I know you're not saying this, and I'm cautious of not kind of setting up endless Aunt Sally's, but that that somehow if we were trying to avoid a postcode lottery, that would make commissioning better. I know you're not actually saying that, but I don't think it would, and it clearly hasn't. So whatever the problem with erratic or less than 100% or less than good commissioning, it kind of isn't the postcode lottery, I think. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm not trying to argue, put up a case you haven't made and then say you've got it wrong. I just think that whatever the problem with commissioning is, it's probably not one that the postcode lottery or the lack of it has actually created. But do come back to me if that's not fair. Would there be a greater acceptance of differences if there were more transparency? Again, all these are interesting questions. I think the present government kind of thinks so. The present government is fascinating to look at. And one of its most interesting foibles, if I can call it that, is the desire to publish data and list things and churn out numbers. About 3 days ago, for those of you who are interested, the Department for Communities and Local Government published the spending per head of all upper tier local authority, unitaries, London boroughs and Met districts, I think they are, in England, from Hackney at the top to, Wokingham at the bottom, whichever it is. It's a list like that, ranging from £1,900 in Hackney to £750 in Wokingham or wherever it was at the bottom. Now, whether this generates transparency and understanding and accountability or something else, it's hard to tell. I mean, I'd be interested to know how many people actually look at the figures, actually, myself. But transparency, it'd be hard. It's very difficult in a democracy, in a properly functioning democracy, to argue against transparency. I do think there's a risk, however, with too much transparency, that it's very, very hard to know who will analyse all the transparent stuff in order to make sense of it for anybody. Slightly felt that about some, if I'm be honest, about say this about some of the stuff that came out of all that WikiLeaks stuff. A few days was interesting, but after a point, you thought perhaps a bit less, and understanding it more might have been better. So I don't think any of us as good Democrats, which I'm sure we all are, could argue with transparency, but it's not likely to improve accountability unless most people who are functioning in a democracy gain something from it, and I'm not 100% they always will. And then on the resource distribution question, I mean, I think British democracy is an embarrassment, if you ask me, in terms of this kind of thing. The idea that we have an established democracy to which, putting it bluntly, other people look up, which often people look up to, 1,000-year evolved democracy, in which, in effect, all taxes are set by central government in London, is just infantilising the whole of the rest of the government system. It's a disgrace. And no government of any party can do anything about it. It appears the present government is holding a resource review, which is, in principle, trying, and I'm sure I actually think Eric Pickles genuinely wants to do this, trying to return the business rate to local government so that at least some authorities would raise enough from council tax and business rate to fund their existing or their current relatively narrow remaining set of spending, the things they have to spend money on. But actually, if you look at the way it's going to happen, it's going to leave the government making decisions most of the time on how much each council can spend, because there'll have to be a redistribution of money from one set of councils to all the others. So it's going to be hard to escape, and I know they're trying to find a way to do this, hard to escape that trap. So do I think there should be more local taxes? Yes. Do I think more power should be distributed away from the centre of government? Yes. Are there perfectly good and well-functioning social democracies where this happens at least as well or better than Britain? For sure. Germany most obviously, but not. And Germany is a country very like Britain in many ways, but a much smaller Gini coefficient, much more federal government system, transparent redistribution of money between the lender, and in the terms we're discussing, it's a federal country, but it actually gets further towards eradicating postcode lottery problems.
My name's John Griffiths. I work for a company called Rocket Science. Talk about layers of government, Tony. I just wonder whether, I haven't really thought this through, but going up a level, have you thought about the role that the European Union has in this, in the sense that the EU is there to try and create this level playing field and a sort of harmonisation of the single market to eradicate inefficiencies in the market? And there was a time actually when the UK government, less so now, actually railed against lots of efforts which actually had the desired effect from Brussels was actually to raise standards through better healthcare, better social provision and so on, this sort of social chapter aspect of the market. And yeah, I'm just thinking about the effect that that's having is actually the opposite. The UK is actually, to an extent, playing the race to the bottom in order to win, to attract businesses, which I think, there's that aspect of a lottery which I'm just wondering whether you've factored that into some of your thinking.
I mean, there's no question that one of the many struggles between the perceived federalist EU and British Eurosceptics, if I can polarise it like that just for the purposes of the argument, is that the EU has tried to extend its role, including certainly for many years an attempt to precisely to reallocate resources between the then EU countries so as to level up the poorest, to catch up, or at least regions within poorer countries, to try to catch up at least with the average for the EU. Now that all, and it was always opposed, of course, by the more Eurosceptic of governments, and I think this is not my field, but I'm pretty sure that when such resources arrived in Britain, they were kind of netted off the resources the areas were going to get anyway or something. There was some, others will know more about this. But that's all stopped really, hasn't it, with the accession of all the large number of countries with very much lower GDPs per head, even than lagging parts of Britain and Germany, which have made it almost impossible to retain anything, keep anything like that kind of effort to redistribute resources within the EU to regions that had relatively low GDP per head. So it still leaves Europe, of course, with the opportunity to try to create level playing fields in trade, criminal justice. I was listening to something on the radio yesterday, I think, about levelling up the treatment of victims across Europe. So there is still the possibility of using legislation for these kind of pan-European sort of equalisation activities. But I think they're now, and others will know much more about this than me. As I say, I'm not an expert, by no means, never studied EU policy. I think there's very little financial transfer going on now between European countries, other than the automatic transfer that comes with some countries, again, poor Germany, often Germany pay huge amounts in, and other countries get money out. So there is some redistribution in that way. But the idea of conscious equalisation, I think, has largely died out now, and trying to level up the countries that were furthest behind in terms of economic output per head. not much of a role there, I suspect.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tony. We asked you for a powerful idea, by which I think we meant an idea that would, if not absolutely changing minds, at least would open minds to new ways of looking at an issue. You've certainly done that for us. You've given us the tools, I think, to tease out many dimensions of this question. Ethical and moral ones, certainly political ones, practical ones, and not least the how we should apply some rigour to thinking about whether we are talking about inputs or outcomes in looking at public services in particular. Last time, Andy Sawford encouraged us to, I think, have more courage in the way that we see change coming in local government, in increasing localisation and the scope for diversity in services. I think for many of us it's very easy to be fearful that the extent of reorganisation going on at the moment, allied with public expenditure cuts, will result in all the more damaging aspects of discretion in service provision. I think you've encouraged us to look at perhaps what role we can play in encouraging a race to the top, and the scaling up of the best services, and encouraging the best possible practice. So, and thank you for letting us test you with so many and varied questions. Before we finally thank Tony and go out for a drink and some more opportunity to talk, you may not know that each time we've used a different piece of music to introduce each lecture and try to find a piece that's relevant to the topic. And I think our resident expert was very challenged by finding music that would illustrate a postcode lottery. Some of you may have recognised that you came in to some glorious music from the Bach double violin concerto. Many ideas behind that choice, most of which would certainly land me in Andrew's favourite column, Sude's Corner. But essentially, there we have an example of very different lines of music, seemingly independent in shape and in rhythm, coming together into a beautiful and logical whole. And what better example of how different elements of local services, intelligently engineered, can come together into a successful and mutually beneficial whole. Yes. Thank you very much.